Philadelphia, June 27, 1996. The kind of humid night that makes candlelight waver and secrets sweat. A well-known attorney, Thomas Capano, polished cufflinks, practiced smile, chose a table at the Panorama, the kind of place where power talks in a whisper. Across from him sat Anne Marie Fahey, the Delaware governor's scheduling secretary, 20-something, composed, but carrying a decision that weighed more than the silverware. She'd come to end an entanglement. He'd come to change her mind. The room hummed with low conversation, but at their table, the silence did most of the speaking. A waitress would later remember the unease. How Anne Marie barely touched her meal. How a signature slid across a check with someone else's name. How the air felt tight around them. That was the last verified sighting of her alive. Night deepened. Capano steered her car across the state line, back to his rented residence in Wilmington, a place he'd kept since separating from his wife. A house just minutes from Anne Marie's apartment. And, as it turned out, a few miles from the truth. He insisted they talk. That word people use when they mean control. Sometime after, the lights went out. On the evening, on her careful future, on a woman who had finally decided to let go. 2 days later, she missed a dinner with her sister. Anne Marie didn't miss things. Groceries sat unbagged in her kitchen. Shoes waited where they shouldn't. A brand new pantsuit lay unopened, as if time had stopped mid-plan. Her purse still held her wallet and ID, but the keys were gone. The smallest objects often make the loudest absence. In that quiet, the police felt what seasoned investigators come to trust. The room was telling them she hadn't walked out freely. Before dawn, detectives knocked on the attorney's door. Capano looked steady, the kind of steady that is practiced. He offered narrative polished at the edges. Yes, once there had been a relationship, but that chapter, he said, had closed. Yes, they'd shared dinner in the city. Yes, he'd taken her by his house to hand over a gift, some groceries, small practicalities. Then his version, he drove her home. And that was that. She was moody, he volunteered, sometimes despondent, and she had a free Friday. Maybe she'd taken off just to breathe. One more thing. The children were asleep upstairs, so no, the officers couldn't come in and look around. It was just past 3:30 a.m., and already the story had too many commas and not enough periods. Monday arrived without Anne Marie at her desk. The world kept moving, but her calendar, the thing she lived inside, stopped. Detectives circled back to her building and spoke to a downstairs neighbor. A single set of steps heavier than hers, late Thursday night. Footfalls that didn't match the light rhythm of a young woman returning home. The kind of detail that sounds small until it echoes. Friends, co-workers, relatives. No calls. No charges on accounts. Nothing after June 28th. In missing person work, the empty ledger is an alarm bell. Last person seen with her? The attorney. Investigators crossed the state line to Philadelphia to make sure the restaurant memory was real. Wasn't just a story varnished to shine. The waitress recognized both faces. She remembered a tension that sat between them like a third-place setting. She remembered that the check slid toward Anne Marie, that she signed his name. She remembered how their voices dimmed whenever she approached. Scenes like that don't prove a crime, but they frame one. As the circle tightened, another truth came into focus. The relationship had bloomed in shadow, gifts delivered, meetings tucked out of sight, until charm lost its sheen and control underneath showed its teeth. By spring, Anne Marie confided to friends that what looked like romance on the sidewalk felt like pressure behind closed doors. She wanted distance. He didn't. And when she found steadier ground with a banker named Michael Scanlon, kind, measured, the kind of prospect that hints at a proposal, the past refused to let her walk clean. In conversations tucked into kitchens and hallways, she used words like followed and afraid. Rejection is a simple act. Some men make it complicated. Then jurisdiction shifted. A Delaware resident, last verified in Pennsylvania. That's when the FBI stepped in. The case turned federal, and with it came the quiet discipline of agents who do more listening than talking. Special Agent Eric Alpert from the FBI's Wilmington office conferred with local detectives and a federal prosecutor. Phones and credit cards, those silent witnesses, were pulled and placed under a forensic lamp. One purchase glowed like a lit match. $308 at a place called Wallpaper Warehouse, posted 2 days after Anne Marie vanished. The number on the receipt dialed into air-based carpets. Different name, same counter, same point, floor covering. For an assistant U.S. attorney who knew how homes change shape after violence, the implication felt immediate, physical, roll a problem up, cover the rest with something new. It was a theory, yes, but a theory with a receipt. And theories, when they're good, tell you where to knock next. But theories don't open doors. Probable cause does. The Bureau and local detectives widened their canvas. A housekeeper's memory supplied the color they needed. The week after Anne Marie's disappearance, her cleaning day was canceled. Odd, the attorney said, because the children hadn't visited. Yet on the very night he first spoke to police, he claimed the kids were upstairs, sleeping, his reason to block a search. Inconsistency is a detective's compass. 3 weeks on, the housekeeper returned. The living room love seat, gone. So was the carpet, in their place. 2 chairs, a brand new rug, a room rearranged like a story retold. Those details, alongside the dinner, the timeline, the lies that tripped over one another, that was the Bureau's bridge to a warrant. The affidavit ran 30-plus pages, built like a careful machine. And on July 31st, agents and detectives stepped across the threshold of Capano's Wilmington home, with the law at their back. They worked slowly, the Bureau way, letting the house speak. In the great room, where conversations lingered and tempers can heat the air, the team found what the housekeeper had described. Fresh carpet, new arrangement. Walls and baseboards looked scrubbed innocence. But meticulous doesn't always mean immaculate. On the baseboard, 2 faint brown freckles. Nothing to the naked eye, unless the naked eye belongs to someone who has trained it. Swabs lifted tiny traces. Back at the FBI lab, chemistry would add its voice. Phenolphthalein kissing a pinprick and blooming pink. A whisper that reads like, blood, not a confession, not a body, not a weapon, but a start. And in the Bureau's book, a start is what you build on. One verified fact at a time, until a story that resists daylight has nowhere left to hide. And that is where the night of June 27th left us. Candlelight, a tense meal, a drive across the border, a quiet apartment with groceries turning warm, and the federal hands that would not let go. The FBI had entered the narrative, and with them came a different tempo, steady steps, patient pressure, and a belief that even the most careful lies leave footprints. In every investigation, there's a moment when the air changes, when theory hardens into trace evidence, when facts begin to whisper their own version of the truth. For the FBI, that moment came inside the sterile light of their Washington lab. The samples, those almost invisible brown spots collected from Capano's baseboard, were placed under the delicate choreography of forensic chemistry. The phenolphthalein test had already blushed pink, a telltale sign of blood. But the Bureau needed more than color. They needed identity. The only problem? Anne Marie's parents were gone. No parental DNA meant no direct genetic match. And her siblings' DNA, too distant for absolute certainty. For a while, it seemed the science would hit a dead end. Then, a small entry in Anne Marie's personal calendar sparked hope. She'd donated blood a month before her disappearance. That sample, if found, could become her voice from beyond. Agents moved fast. They subpoenaed the blood bank, but the news was grim. Her blood had already been processed into plasma and shipped overseas. And plasma, stripped of red and white cells, carries almost no DNA at all. Still, the Bureau doesn't surrender to almost. They reached across federal channels and pulled every string available, managing to intercept the shipment before it vanished into an international supply chain. When the sealed container arrived back in Washington, the lab's fluorescent lights hummed like an omen. Senior DNA analyst Alan Giusti examined the faint golden plasma and found a miracle in the residue, traces of red cells clinging to the edges. That was enough. He extracted what little DNA he could, compared it to the sequence recovered from the blood on Capano's baseboard, and waited for the pattern to align. It matched. perfectly. Statistically, there was only a 1 in a billion chance it belonged to anyone other than Anne Marie Fahey. It was the FBI's first undeniable physical link. Blood that proved she had bled inside his home. Outside the lab, Capano continued his daily life untouched, polished, smiling, untouchable. To the casual eye, he was still the respected former Deputy Attorney General, a man who attended fundraisers and carried the weight of a good name. But beneath that veneer, the Bureau could feel the tension building. Capano's past was his undoing. Too many connections, too many people who'd seen the cracks behind the charm. He was the oldest of 4 brothers, each bound by loyalty and blood and money. They ran construction companies, real estate empires. The Capano name meant influence in Delaware. That influence now stood in the Bureau's way. Agents knew someone had helped him. A man like Thomas Capano didn't haul a body, carpet, and couch on his own. They just needed one brother to slip, one to value his conscience over his bloodline. And then a small voice broke the silence. Sean Taylor, a project manager for the Capano construction business, contacted the Bureau in secret. He feared for his job, maybe his life, but he couldn't ignore what he'd seen. On Monday, July 1st, just 3 days after Marie vanished, he was ordered to haul 4 nearly empty dumpsters from one of Louis Capano's job sites. Empty or not, they had to go immediately. That made no sense. It was expensive, wasteful, out of character for the Capanos. Unless, of course, those dumpsters held something that couldn't wait until morning. That lead reignited the fire. Federal subpoenas hit the family's construction records. Hauling logs, dump schedules, employee rosters. Every transaction dissected under Bureau eyes. Agents traced where those dumpsters went. A landfill in Delaware, under the heat of August sun. The FBI's evidence recovery team combed through mountains of waste. 4 days of stench, sweat, and silence, sifting through trash for fragments of carpet, fabric, or bone. They found nothing. The landfill search ended in frustration. No couch, no rug, no trace of Anne Marie. But in the Bureau's long game, frustration isn't failure. It's a pressure point. When the physical trail runs cold, they turn to human frailty. And human frailty was about to speak. Months passed. The Bureau waited, patient as gravity. Then a quiet knock on their door came from inside, not from a stranger, but from family. Jerry Capano, the youngest brother. He'd been caught with illegal firearms, drugs in the house, a child endangered, a stack of charges that could bury him. But federal agents had a different offer. Immunity if he told the truth about what happened to Anne Marie Fahey. At first, Jerry resisted. Thomas wasn't just his brother. He was a family star, their rescuer, their shadow patriarch. But the threat of prison and the image of his own children losing a father weighed heavy. On November 8, 1997, more than a year after Anne Marie disappeared, Jerry Capano sat across from FBI Special Agent Eric Alpert and Assistant U.S. Attorney Colm Connolly. With his lawyer beside him, hands trembling, he started talking. He said it began months before the killing. Thomas had told him a story that someone was extorting him, threatening his children. He needed cash and maybe a gun. Jerry handed him both $8,000 and a .38 revolver. Months passed, and Thomas returned the gun, claiming the money had solved the problem. Then came June 29th, 1996, the morning after Anne Marie vanished. Thomas showed up at Jerry's house before sunrise. He looked off, eyes hollow, voice urgent. "Jerry," he said, "I need your help. I need the boat." At first, Jerry refused. He didn't want to be involved. But Thomas pressed the bloodline button. "You're my brother. I have no one else." Jerry gave in. They met at Thomas's garage. A heavy cooler sat waiting. Jerry never opened it, but he knew. Every instinct screamed that whatever was inside was once alive. They loaded into the truck and drove to Stone Harbor, New Jersey, where Jerry kept his boat. On the dock, they moved the cooler under a moonlit silence. 2 men, a heavy burden, and the sound of water lapping at wood. The Atlantic waited, vast, cold, indifferent. They motored 60 miles offshore. Thomas said it would be deep enough. Heaving breaths, they tipped the cooler overboard. It didn't sink. Thomas cursed, grabbed a shotgun and fired into it, slugs tearing through plastic in grief. Still, it floated, so he hauled it back aboard, opened it, and began wrapping the body with the boat's own anchors. Jerry turned away. He couldn't watch. He just heard the splash, then silence. When he looked back, Thomas stood at the stern, staring into the dark, a pale calf, a foot slipping beneath the surface. Back on land, Thomas wasn't finished. He made Jerry drive back to Wilmington, where a blood-stained couch waited in the garage. Together, they hauled it and a rolled carpet into a construction dumpster at one of Louis Capano's sites. Then silence. Thomas never spoke of it again. Jerry, shaking, finished a confession. For the Bureau, it was gold, first-hand detail, corroborated by earlier fragments. For the Capano family, it was betrayal written in ink. Within days, Louis Capano, another brother, appeared with his lawyer and confirmed that, yes, he'd emptied those dumpsters early. That was the final click in the lock. The Bureau had enough. On November 12, 1997, FBI surveillance teams shadowed Thomas Capano as he loaded luggage into his vehicle with another brother, Joseph. They were heading toward the airport. Agents feared flight. Assistant U.S. Attorney Connolly was pulled from the grand jury room by an emergency pager. 911, Capano's on the move. Minutes later, orders came through. Stop him. Now. The Bureau closed in. At 17 months since Marie's disappearance, the man who once stood above the law was finally in custody. And yet, even with him behind bars, one question still echoed through the Bureau's halls. Where was Anne Marie Fahey? No body. No murder weapon, just blood, a brother's confession, and a truth that refused to stay buried. But for the FBI, that was enough to keep digging. Because the Bureau doesn't chase closure. They chase proof. And the next proof was waiting just below the waves. The Atlantic has a way of keeping secrets. Cold, patient, indifferent. For months, it guarded the truth beneath its surface. But the Bureau has patience too. And in late 1997, the waves began to talk. The FBI's next lead came not from a confession, not from a warrant, but from chance. A fisherman, 6 miles off the coast of Delaware, called in with something strange. A large, white cooler drifting alone in the water. No lid, 2 bullet holes, and stains that looked an awful lot like dry blood. He'd found it on the weekend of July 4th, 1996, just days after Anne Marie vanished. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. He patched the holes, cleaned it, and used it for bait and beer on summer weekends. But when he saw the evening news nearly a year later, showing the face of Thomas Capano and hearing whispers about a cooler used in the crime, his stomach turned cold. He picked up the phone and called the FBI. Agents drove 2 hours through a rain-slick morning to Bay City, New Jersey, where the man kept his boat. The cooler sat exactly where he'd left it. Scarred plastic, the patches still visible. And there, under layers of sun-bleached grime, the Bureau found the barcode sticker. They traced it. It matched perfectly to a purchase made with Capano's credit card, April 22nd, 1996. 2 months before Anne Marie Fahey disappeared. That cooler, the same one Jerry Capano described under oath, had resurfaced in the Atlantic like a ghost, validating every word of his story. For the FBI, it was a gift from the sea, physical evidence, irrefutable, a silent witness that had floated for months, waiting to be recognized. Still, they needed the weapon, the one that fired the shot, ended a life, and started this chase. They combed through gun store records, searching for any connection to Capano, his friends, or his many quiet companions. And there, buried in paperwork, was another spark. A woman named Debbie McIntyre. 12 years of an affair with Thomas Capano, running parallel to his obsession with Anne Marie. 2 lives, 2 lovers, one man controlling both with the same quiet authority. Her name surfaced again in phone records. Capano had called her from Stone Harbor, New Jersey, the morning after Anne Marie vanished. The same place Jerry said they dumped the body. FBI agents knocked on her door. She smiled, nervous, polite. They asked if she owned a gun. At first, she said no. Then her cheeks flushed, her voice faltered. Finally, she admitted it. A .22 caliber Beretta, bought 6 weeks before Anne Marie disappeared. She'd thrown away, she said, in a garbage can. A story too convenient, too clean. When asked if anyone knew she'd purchased that gun, she said just one name, Tom Capano. The Bureau could feel the net tightening. The Beretta, the cooler, the blood. Each piece of bone in the skeleton of truth. Under gentle but relentless questioning, Debbie McIntyre finally cracked. She confessed that Capano had asked her to buy the gun for him. She didn't know why. Or maybe she did and couldn't face it. Either way, her denial evaporated in the fluorescent interrogation light. The FBI had the final tool they needed to assemble the murder's timeline. By October 26, 1998, the case reached the courtroom, a collision between law and ego, truth and reputation. The prosecution's evidence was a mosaic of precision. 2 specks of blood, a cooler with bullet holes, a brother's testimony, and the calm, methodical work of federal agents who refused to be outmaneuvered by power or politics. Thomas Capano's defense arrived with bravado. They painted him not as a murderer, but as a man trapped in a tragedy of his own making, a man covering up a terrible accident. And then, in a twist that sent the room still, Capano took the stand himself. He admitted it all except the murder. Yes, he disposed of Anne Marie's body, he said. Yes, he'd asked his brothers to help hide the evidence. But he wasn't the killer. According to him, it was Debbie McIntyre. He claimed she'd burst into his home that night, jealous, hysterical, gun in hand. That Anne Marie had died by accident in the chaos. They had merely covered it up to protect the woman he still loved. The courtroom held its breath. But the FBI had anticipated this lie. They had found deep in state archives an old case file, one Capano himself had prosecuted as Assistant Attorney General in 1976. In that case, a killer had disposed of a body in a creek. Capano's quote from that trial still existed in the record. The killer would have gotten away, he told reporters, if he dumped the body in the Atlantic. History doesn't always repeat. Sometimes it confesses. The prosecution dismantled his testimony piece by piece. Anne Marie's blood in his home. The cooler purchased in advance. The weapon obtained through a lover's hand. The lies about the children asleep upstairs. The sudden purchase of a new carpet. The brother's eyewitness account. Every puzzle piece clicked into place, framed by the Bureau's patient work. And when the jury returned, the silence felt heavier than law itself. They found Thomas Capano guilty of first-degree murder. The judge read the sentence, death by lethal gas. It was the first time in Delaware history that a man was convicted of capital murder without a body or a weapon. The courtroom exhaled. The FBI agents, the quiet figures who had followed every thread from a pink chemical reaction on a baseboard to a floating cooler in the Atlantic, finally allowed themselves the smallest nod. Justice had arrived, carried not by confession, but by evidence, by science, by persistence. Anne Marie Fahey was never found, but her absence was filled with truth carved by investigators who refused to stop at missing. In the Bureau's files, the case is closed. But in Delaware, when summer heat rolls across the water and the night feels heavy with memory, the story of Thomas Capano still hangs in the air. A reminder that even power, wealth, and charm cannot outswim the tide of justice. Prison walls have a way of silencing applause. No courtroom drama, no news camera, just a hum of fluorescent lights and the steady tick of time. Relentless, impartial. Inside Delaware's death row, Thomas Capano traded designer suits for a numbered uniform. The polished attorney, once revered in state offices and political circles, now spent his days in a concrete cell. His voice reduced to echoes and appeals. But outside those walls, the Bureau was still writing the final pages. Because the FBI doesn't just close a file, they document, they learn, they evolve. And this case, this strange bodiless homicide, had rewritten the very playbook. In the weeks following the verdict, Assistant U.S. Attorney Colm Connolly, the man who led the prosecution with an investigator's heart, walked the press through the evidence one last time. The blood, the carpet, The cooler, every link meticulously verified by FBI labs. He told reporters something that would later be quoted in federal training manuals. We reaffirmed faith in the system, not because it was easy, but because the truth refused to stay buried. It wasn't bravado. It was a hard truth of every federal case, when science and persistence outweigh influence and power. The Bureau's internal memo on the Fahey case spread across field offices nationwide. It became a study in investigative endurance, how a missing person inquiry evolved into a capital case without a corpse, how two brown stains, invisible to the untrained eye, became the linchpin of a murder trial, and how one receipt, one cooler, one patient forensic analyst turned suspicion into certainty. The lesson was clear. In the absence of a body, the truth still bleeds. You just have to know where to look. In 1999, the Delaware Supreme Court upheld the verdict. Capano's defense tried everything: procedural challenges, evidence disputes, claims of bias. But each appeal came apart under the same precision that had built the case against him. FBI agents testified again, calm, factual, unflinching. The science didn't waver. The timeline didn't bend. The lies remained the same. Eventually, the highest courts agreed. The evidence was overwhelming. The verdict stood. For the Fahey family, justice didn't feel like celebration. It felt like quiet relief, a stillness where pain could finally settle. Anne Marie's sister spoke softly outside the courthouse. The Bureau never gave up. They treated her like she mattered. That's what justice is. Inside his cell, Capano's arrogance began to wilt. He wrote letters, long, rambling defenses of his innocence, to anyone who would listen. But time has a way of stripping the varnish from every story. His influence faded. His supporters grew scarce. Still, the FBI monitored every appeal, every motion, ensuring the truth they'd built couldn't be undone. It wasn't vengeance. It was closure. The Bureau's duty carried to the last breath of the case. Then came the final headline. September 19, 2011, 15 years after Marie's disappearance, guards found Thomas Capano dead in his cell. Heart failure. The report said, no violence, no mystery, just an ending. When the call reached the retired agents who had once worked his case, none celebrated. There was no victory in death, only the quiet affirmation that justice had outlived him. Years later, new recruits at Quantico still study the Capano case, not for the horror, but for the discipline, for the relentless methodology that turned fragments into truth, for the way the Bureau balanced empathy with precision, grief with evidence. It stands as a reminder that the FBI's greatest weapon is not the badge or the gun, but the persistence to listen when others stop looking. In Delaware, people still remember Anne Marie Fahey, not for how she died, but for how fiercely others refused to let her be forgotten. A scholarship now bears her name. A bench near the Wilmington waterfront carries a small brass plaque. For Marie, light endures. And when the summer wind sweeps through, you can almost hear it, a whisper carried over the tide, as if the ocean itself remembers. The Bureau's report ends with one final line, understated and human. Case closed, justice served. Evidence conclusive. Victim never recovered. But those who were there know the truth behind those words. Justice, in this case, wasn't just served. It was earned, piece by piece, fact by fact, against power, against privilege, against the odds. And that is how the FBI taught the world that even in the absence of a body, truth still leaves a trace. The years rolled forward, quiet but relentless. Courtrooms emptied. Reporters moved on to new scandals, and the case that once gripped Delaware faded from the evening news. But inside the FBI's archives, deep within the beige filing drawers of Quantico, the name Anne Marie Fahey still lived, not just as a victim, but as a turning point. What began as a disappearance, a woman late for dinner, became one of the most groundbreaking federal investigations in modern history. It forced the Bureau to evolve, to modernize the very definition of proof. Because until this case, no body homicides were the kind of puzzles that haunted investigators. Unsolved, uncertain, always one fact sure conviction. After the Capano investigation, that changed. The Bureau's forensic division used this case as a template for a new generation of field protocols. It was no longer enough to rely on the obvious: weapons, fingerprints, confessions. Agents were now trained to look for what the human eye misses, to treat the smallest trace like a full conversation between the crime and the truth. Those two brown specks of blood on a baseboard became legendary in training modules. They weren't evidence in the traditional sense. They were proof of life and death in the same molecule. FBI instructors began every forensic seminar the same way. If you can see it, it's evidence. If you can't, it's potential evidence. The difference is how long you're willing to look. The Capano case wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about expanding the boundaries of certainty. In the years that followed, forensic science leapt forward. The Bureau's labs adopted new microDNA extraction protocols. Born directly from Alan Justi's near-impossible recovery of Anne Marie's genetic code from plasma. A sample once dismissed as useless became a beacon of possibility. Now, every field agent learned to preserve, not presume. Every drop of liquid, every smear of dust, every fiber caught under a baseboard. Potential truth. The message was clear. Don't wait for a body to speak. Let the science do the talking. Beyond the lab, the case redefined collaboration. The FBI's partnership with Delaware State Police, the Attorney General's office, and the U.S. Attorney's team set a new gold standard for interagency trust. In many investigations before, pride drew borders. Jurisdiction blurred responsibility. But here, unity saw what ego could not. Local detectives built the story. Federal agents amplified it with science. And together, they made history. By 2001, the Bureau officially cited the Fahey investigation as one of the most successful interdepartmental collaborations of the decade, a model for how the FBI should approach emotionally charged, politically sensitive crimes. It proved that power could no longer protect privilege, not when federal precision met human persistence. The case also left a quieter legacy, the emotional kind. Inside the Bureau, many who'd worked it carried Anne Marie's memory long after the paperwork closed. To them, she wasn't a file number or a forensic slide. She was a symbol of unfinished stories, the people who vanished without justice, whose families lived suspended in grief. Agent Eric Alpert, now retired, once told a class of recruits, every victim leaves something behind. Sometimes it's a body. Sometimes it's just blood on a wall. But if you listen carefully, if you stay long enough, you can still hear them calling for closure. Those words became a kind of unofficial creed. The younger agents wrote them on white boards, murmured them before heading into cold case briefings. A quiet reminder that justice is not about fame. It's about endurance. Even the legal system changed. Prosecutors across the country began citing the Capano precedent in no-body homicide trials. Defense attorneys could no longer argue that without a corpse, there could be no conviction. The Delaware verdict had rewritten that rule. Judges began allowing more forensic probability into evidence, trusting precision of DNA science and the credibility of federal laboratories. The ripple effect traveled coast to coast, from state courts in California to federal trials in New York. Every one of them, in some small way, carried the fingerprints of this case. And then there was her family. The Faheys never got what most families pray for: a grave, a final goodbye, a place to lay flowers. But they did get truth. And sometimes that's all justice can give. Anne Marie's name now lives in foundations, scholarships, and candlelight vigils. Her story has become a cautionary tale about power, obsession, and the kind of charm that hides control. Every year, at Delaware's waterfront, people still gather to light candles, the wind flickering them sideways, the water catching the glow. Someone always reads the same quote, the one engraved on her memorial bench. Light endures. For the FBI, that light burns too. In every file reopened, every trace examined twice, every voice refusing to fade. Because the Capano case wasn't just a story about a man who believed himself untouchable. It was about a system that learned how to reach anyone, anywhere with patience and proof. A case that began with silence, ended with legacy. And somewhere in that long, quiet stretch between the first dinner candle and the final courtroom verdict, the Bureau proved something simple something eternal. That justice is not measured by what's found, but by what's never abandoned. There's a rhythm to the night, the way the city hums when truth is about to rise, the way the air feels heavier before confession, before verdict, before name finds peace again. Philadelphia sleeps. Wilmington exhales. But somewhere between those two cities, the ghost of Anne Marie Fahey still lingers. Not in fear, not in tragedy, but in testimony. Because the Bureau listened, and the Bureau remembered,